The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, you likely know it as NATO. And you also likely know that representatives from its 29 member countries, including the United States, met last week in Brussels. But what about the history of this nearly 70-year-old alliance? For context, past and present, I spoke with Paul Musgrave, American foreign policy expert and University of Massachusetts Amherst assistant professor.
Back after the end of the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves at loggerheads over who was going to control the fate of the continent. And in the middle of that early Cold War competition, U.S. leaders worked with Western European leaders to create what they called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, a permanent military alliance between the United States, major powers, Britain, France, Canada, Italy, in order to deter Soviet aggression, to deter renewal of a world war. And over the years, NATO grew to expand other countries, West Germany, Spain and Portugal, Greece and Turkey, and over the last 20 years has expanded even further into Eastern Europe and what used to be the former Soviet Union. But throughout, the purpose has remained the same. So
1949, when President Truman was there and NATO was established, how did the then Soviet Union react to that?
Not well. This was further confirmation for then Stalin and other Soviet leaders that the United States and its allies were committed to militarizing diplomacy. And this was a time where both countries were trying to figure out what the other side was all about. You'd had a blockade by the Soviet Union of American forces in West Berlin that had led to the Berlin airlift. Yep. There'd been fights, different governments had been overthrown by the Soviets. The CIA had been intervening in elections in France and Italy. Lots of things were going on, but this meant that the Soviet presence would continue to be militarized, and there would continue to be a permanent American military commitment, which in the 1940s even still meant a potential nuclear commitment. This was the Cold War kicking off and lasting for decades.
And then we see an actual Soviet reaction when the Warsaw Pact is formed, right? Which is kind of their answer to NATO in a way. Do you think about it that way?
I think about it that way, and it's their answer to NATO in the sense that NATO is theoretically a democratic or more democratic alignment or league of countries, coming together voluntarily under the clear leadership of the United States. The Warsaw Pact was supposed to be the same, except it was dictated to member states. And there were always some tensions between Moscow and some member states, but there was always a very clear sense that countries like Poland, countries like Hungary would in the end be answerable to Moscow through the Warsaw Pact.
Now, as you've pointed out, that NATO is essentially a military alliance that the U.S. has always been seen as the center of. Would you say that Article 5 is really kind of the key component of NATO? And if so, define Article 5 for people.
So Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is the part of that treaty that says that member states will come to the aid, if requested, of any member state that is attacked. And this was meant to be a continuing legal device for the United States to make a commitment, which the United States had never made in its history before, a permanent commitment to the security of other countries. And so Article 5 is at the core of NATO. It's an expression of a belief that there will be a collective response to any particular act of aggression, which at the time people were thinking about, Moscow might do something in Turkey or Greece. They might make a gesture toward Germany. But if Moscow did that, they would know, the Soviets would know that all of NATO, including, of course, the United States, would respond. And that belief was at the core of how NATO fit into the Cold War, projecting this belief to deter Soviet aggression.
And this idea, the attack on one is an attack on all, really has kind of been at the heart of the discussions we've been hearing about lately. When Article 5 was established in the late 1940s, the idea of a cyber attack wasn't even a notion, but we've actually seen Russia respond in recent years, in the past decade, with these type of attacks, right?
That's right. In 2007, a NATO member, Estonia, actually came under cyber attack from entities connected with the Russian government, but not officially acknowledged to be part of the Russian government, which shut down big parts of the country's government and economy for a month. Estonia is a hugely advanced country technologically, used to be one of the member states of the USSR. It was conquered by the Red Army in 1940, 1941. And it had joined NATO in order to prevent itself from ever coming under Russian domination again. And this cyber attack was really kind of a test. Would this thing that is not an explosive attack, it's not a kinetic attack, but it's still something that we recognize as an attack, trigger Article 5? And in the event, it didn't. Different countries built up their capacity to monitor and to respond to cyber attacks, but they didn't trigger Article 5. In fact, the only time it's been triggered was in September 2001 on behalf of the United States in order to allow NATO to fight in Afghanistan, where its only war has really been in Afghanistan.
So it's so interesting then that obviously these ally countries came together to defend the United States, but more recently we're hearing President Trump waver as to whether or not he would come to the defense of a smaller country were Article 5 triggered.
That's right. I think that President Trump, in some senses, believes that NATO is a bad deal. He complains all the time that other NATO members don't necessarily meet the targets of spending 2% of their GDP on military expenditures as part of the broader effort to provide collective security. Over the last couple of years, different NATO countries have begun to increase their military spending in response to Russian aggression, especially in Ukraine. So there has been an uptick, which President Trump has taken credit for.
But it is a valid criticism, is it not? President Obama raised it as well. Certainly President Trump isn't the first to raise this 2% issue.
He's not the first to raise it.
What's different about how President Trump talks about NATO and has sort of presented the issue?
That's absolutely the crux of all of this. Other presidents have complained about this going all the way back, but what's different about President Trump is that for years he has refused or only grudgingly admitted that NATO was important. And the way that he talks about U.S. relations with Russia, in particular, are directly contradictory to the spirit, to the history, to the purpose of NATO, and to the reasons why NATO continues to be regarded by Europeans as a pillar of their domestic security strategy. And so when President Trump talks about NATO, it's disparaging, it's to blame other Europeans. It's in the context of a trade war in which he's called the European Union, to which most NATO members are also members, a foe of the United States. There's not a lot of confidence building going on here. And during the Cold War, American presidents were very careful to balance economic and security, to balance criticism and praise in order to show that they were good allies working for the benefit of everyone. That has not been the Trump administration's foreign policy.
Is it possible, though, that we're hearing, President Trump obviously being critical, upset, frustrated, but with what's going on with the NATO alliance, we're hearing that publicly, right? But is it possible that Secretary Mattis might be having very different conversations among the NATO members?
Certainly that seems to be how the Defense Department's policy toward NATO has worked. And I use that term advisedly because right now there's 2 or 3 different policies floating around in different parts of the United States government toward NATO. Congress has one set, the Defense Department and the National Security Establishment have their own, and President Trump has yet another one. And you certainly see former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, Secretary Jim Mattis at the Defense Department, as you said, trying to reassure allies that the United States remains committed to NATO. But then President Trump will do something to blow up those assurances, sometimes the very next day. He's departed from prepared texts that were full of these sorts of reassurances and meant to keep NATO together in order to criticize NATO instead of supporting it. And that's really, if you're sitting in Berlin, if you're sitting in London, if you're sitting in Paris and trying to understand how important NATO is to the United States, you have to wonder, if the President of the United States doesn't seem to believe in NATO, how much should you trust somebody who works for that president and is telling you that the U.S. remains committed?